Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. Two quick things before introducing you to my guest. First, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast by clicking on the follow button and also clicking on the bell icon so you are alerted to each new edition of the program. Second, in addition to being the producer of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I've written 4 books, 3 novels, and 1 short story collection. In the episode notes, you will find a short link to my Amazon page and all 4 of those titles. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Judith Valente, a journalist, poet, and the author of 6 spirituality titles and 3 poetry collections. Her most recent book, which we will be discussing during this episode, is titled The Italian Soul: How to Savor the Full Joys of Life. Now, Ms. Valente worked previously as an on-air correspondent covering faith and values for national PBS television, was also a staff writer at the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and was twice a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in journalism. Clearly, this woman knows how to report. She knows how to write. Valente grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey. For those of you who are boxing fans, you might remember a name called Chuck Wepner. He was the so-called Bayonne Bleeder. Heavyweight boxer. His claim to fame was he fought Muhammad Ali, but the man bled a lot, so they called him the Bayonne Bleeder. That's completely aside from what we're going to be talking about, but it's a point of reference. So there she was in Bayonne, New Jersey, surrounded by a large, boisterous Italian family, which I can totally relate to. 1 of 7 children, Italian-American. And just as a point of interest, my name sounds British as Consul. It's actually Consilvio until Ellis Island truncated that name like they did with so many other Italian names. And my mom's side of the family is Sacco. So I'm 100% Italian. I even took Ancestry.com, did the spit test, and it came out 87% Italian, which is about as pure Italian as you can get. A lot of crossbreeding has gone on over the years, and Italy has been overrun by many, many people and tribes and ethnicities and so on. She also spent much of her adult life in Chicago, and what a great city. Valente also serves as a guide during retreats where she teaches how to live a more contemplative life in the secular world. What a challenge that is nowadays, especially for young people who are just completely fixated on social media and video, their phones, and so on. How do you get contemplative in a world like we have today? Judith Valente, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Mike. I'm so honored.
I've been looking forward to this. We booked months ago, and before we actually get started, I wanted talking about your new book. Talk about your spirituality. Are you a Catholic? Are you a Catholic mystic? Do you pray or meditate? What is your spiritual expression?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Well, I was raised a Catholic and I have remained a Catholic, even though it's often very difficult for me with some of the events that have happened in the recent past in our church. But I feel that it's the faith of my ancestors, as you mentioned about your background, 100% Italian. I'm also 100% Italian American, and so I grew up I grew up seeing my grandfather Benedict Costanzo, for example. I mean this strong man every day sit at the kitchen table with a stack of prayers in front of him, these prayer cards he had, and he would pray. And my mother was very faithful as well, went to novenas, dragged me along as a child, and I didn't much like it when I was a child going to, mass on Wednesday afternoon, for example, these novenas that she would go to on Wednesday afternoons. But looking back on my life now, as a middle-aged woman, I think that I received a certain grace during those periods when I would accompany my mother to her novenas that have served me well in my life. And I like to say, people say, are you a Christian? I don't know how to answer that question. I say, I believe in the message of Jesus. I believe in the message of mercy, the message of hope and compassion of Jesus. It's not necessarily that I identify, so strongly with one religion or another, but that I do identify with the really beautiful and necessary message of Jesus.
Now, you have a book titled How to Be Contemplative. What is the core of the contemplative life, and what is the end goal? How do you live a contemplative life, and to what end?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think people think of it as some complex thing, like you have to go off to some ashram or something, or join a monastery to be a contemplative. But I think being a contemplative simply means cultivating an ability to see the sacred and the poetic in the everyday. And that's really, Mike, why I was so drawn to Italy, not only because I'm an Italian American, but because I've always been interested in how to live a more contemplative life. And I saw in the people of Italy, in their everyday practices and customs and traditions, I saw that they were on to something. They were living a contemplative life naturally. They were recognizing the sacred and the poetic in the ordinary naturally. So I became very drawn to that.
So the contemplative life, what does it do for the Italians? What does it do for anybody who's living a contemplative life? Is it all about centeredness and contentment? Is it about bridging the physical and the metaphysical? Maybe there's multiple goals, but what do you see as, if somebody was to say to you, why should I worry about being contemplative? What do I get out of it? What is the answer?
Yeah, I think that we all are looking for a certain amount of connectedness and wanting to know what is our place? Why are we here? What is our place in the world? And um, I think Italians bridge that gap between the divine and the common and the ordinary very well. For example, I've been here now a month. I usually stay a month or more when I come. And there's been two street festivals celebrating different versions of the Madonna. And so people parade through the streets with this life-size statue. These hardy men parade through the streets with a life-size statue of the Madonna on their shoulders. And they, every church that they pass in the community, the bells ring and people line the streets and make the sign of the cross as the statue passes. And well, what is this all about? Is this about worshiping a statue, a sculpture? No, it's about recognizing that the sacred and the divine is with us in the everyday. It's with us in the streets that we walk through every day. If we would just attune our minds, attune our eyes, our ears, our feet to recognize that. And so I think the Italians do that very well, and I wish we would do that more in the United States, as opposed to identifying so much with doctrine. You're a Christian if you believe this. You're not a Christian if you don't believe this. No, I think it's more about how do we live our lives? Do we live our lives trying to build community? Do we live our lives trying to see where God is at work in the everyday of our lives? I think that's perhaps more important than this list of rules that I follow or don't follow.
Yeah, that's such an important point because Christianity, Catholicism used to have a tradition of mysticism. It was about personal experience. It had to do with prayer and meditation and actually experiencing the metaphysical realm, experiencing the supreme being. And today it is just a prescription. It's
Right.
here's the do's and don'ts, and just come to church, put money in the basket, and follow the prescription. But don't worry about reaching out and actually connecting with God. I think there's almost a sense of that's just pure futility. You can't actually reach across to God. And we have a long tradition of mystics in all religions that say this is possible. This is possible if you devote yourself to the and exercise the effort that's inevitably involved in that. I should mention to our listeners that Judith is joining us from the Abruzzo province of Italy, and you spend a lot of time in Italy, correct, Judith? But check me on this. You're an American citizen, but visit Italy regularly.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I can stay here for 3 months at a time, and then you have to leave. Any tourist can come for 3 months without a visa, and my husband and I are trying to get a visa to stay more long term, but it's a bit of a process, so we haven't completely fulfilled that process. But I'm so glad you talked a minute ago, Mike, about that mystical tradition in not only Christianity, but almost every religion, every world religion. And one of the things that got me interested in the contemplative life was a few years ago, I had my first visit to a monastery, a Benedictine monastery. And it was as if I had come home. It was as if I walked in that monastery and I found what I was looking for. There was such a sense of community and hospitality among the sisters. It happened to be a Benedictine community in Atchison, Kansas called Mount St. Scholastica. And I just kept going back and back because I wanted this sense of community that it gave me, this sense of the dailiness of prayer. You know, the sisters get up in the morning and they pray. They pray in the middle of the day and then they pray right before they go to bed. So prayer is a regular part of their rhythm of life. And I found this to be very appealing. And one of the key components of monastic life is hospitality, the acceptance and respect for the stranger. And I see this, you know, in our own country, a country that once welcomed the immigrant and welcomed the stranger. I see this somehow falling apart in our country. And it's another reason why I think we can learn much from the contemplative life. And it would be a very healing thing for our country if we practiced those contemplative values of community building, of building a sense of belonging, and also of hospitality.
Judith, that I'm convinced that one of the reasons the churches are losing parishioners has to do with that there is no mysticism anymore. There is no real, and mysticism sounds maybe esoteric, but there isn't really discussion of personal experience. There's not the sharing of personal experience. Instead, again, like you were saying, is dogma. And people get quite bored with that. People want to be doers. They want to have a personal relationship with the Supreme Being. And the other aspect of this, and I've beaten on this drum several times in the past, although not on this program, is I think that the epidemic of atheism has a lot to do with the characterization of God that is so preposterous, that God loves you, but you're going to be cast into hell forever and tormented forever if you pick the wrong religion. And the list just goes on with what I think most people see as this is a really strange conception of God, because if you were to model a parent after God, then as described in the Bible or as misinterpreted from the Bible, you would end up with child protective services at your door. So, I mean, it's one of those things that I think has been really problematic on both of those fronts. Let's get to your book, though, The Italian Soul, which I recently completed. I bought the audio edition, listened to it, and very, very quickly. It's not a long book for our listeners. It's not a long book, but it is a powerful book, and it is part workbook. And when I say workbook, it's really thought experiments that Judith Valente gives to people at the end of each chapter to try thinking in terms of this or that. So what inspired your writing of the book in that particular structure? We're actually giving people thought experiments.
Well, I think it's always good to give people some prompts from prompts to help them perhaps look at their lives in a way that they haven't looked at it before. So each chapter ends with, a set of questions to ask ourselves, to reflect on, to ponder. But I really wrote it just observing. I was here for 3 months in 2021, between 2021 and 2022, which was right after the COVID epidemic. And that was one of my 3 month stays here. And I began to really, it was the first time I stayed in a small town as well. I'd stayed in bigger cities prior to that. And I began to see that I just began to observe how people live their lives, how important family is, how important the meal table is. Truly, in Italy, the meal table is a communion table. It's the closest thing to the communion altar that I've ever experienced outside of a church, because it's really a time of communion. It's not just a time to sit down and shovel food into your mouth to sustain you physically. It's a time for communion with everybody else around the table, which sustains you spiritually and mentally and emotionally.
Yeah.
And so I really learned a real reverence for the dinner table and living here. And that was just one thing. The other thing was the hospitality of the people. And again, it goes back to this long time monastic value of hospitality, of welcoming the stranger. I mean, people, after a while, after a few weeks, people would see me regularly in the piazza. I lived on a piazza, and they would just come up to me and start talking to me. And then the next thing you know, they'd be inviting me to their house for coffee. Who does that?
Mm.
Who does
You
that
don't get that
anymore?
in America.
No, there was an interesting segment on NPR a couple of years ago about a gentleman who walked from Washington D.C. to New York, or New York to Washington D.C., and he stopped in front of a house because it was a hot day, and he asked the man who was in front of the house, where he could get a bottle of cold water, and the man directed him to a grocery store a few blocks away. And I'm thinking to myself, in Italy, they would just go in the house and give you a glass of water.
Yes. Yes. Solve the problem right now. And it's an opportunity to actually interact with a fellow human being and ask some questions like, what are you doing on foot? Where are you headed? Why are you walking from New York to Washington? And so on. You say in the book, whenever I am in Italy, my experiences seem more immediate and intense. I am by nature a hard charging American, often afflicted with a dual diagnosis of workaholism and overachieverism. Speak to that.
Oh, that's so true, that statement I made in the book. Here, I seem to have time enough for everything. When I'm home, I don't seem to have time for all my tasks. I go to bed at night and my to-do list is still very long. But here, I learned a lesson here that um, you can take time for yourself and take time for self-care and still have time enough, that's the key, for all these other things that you need to do. For example, it's a place where I feel like I'm more open to whatever is unfolding in a particular day. For example, the other night, my husband and I just wanted to go out for a walk in the evening, and we ran into the woman who runs the pizzeria on the other side of the piazza. And she's like, come in, come in, come in. I want to give you an aperitivo, a little a digestive drink, and that they serve in these little cups. And so, we were totally taken off our path for our evening walk. And we ended up spending time in this pizzeria with this woman who's the owner, and then other clients, other customers came in, and they were chatting with us. But it totally threw us off from what we had set out to do. But it was the thing that we needed to do that night. We needed to have that communion, if you will, that community with other people in our neighborhood. And again, the other day, my husband was walking me to get a haircut, and who drives by but a friend we know. And he says, "Get in the car. There's these parachutists are going to be jumping out of a plane to celebrate the liberation of our small town in World War II." So, my husband, instead of walking me to the hairdresser, jumps in the car and goes and sees these parachutists. And it seems like if I was in if I was at home in Illinois, where I live 2 hours south of Chicago, I'd probably say to my friend, "Oh, no, 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 we've got to do these other things. No, 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 thanks, another time." You know what I'm saying, Mike?
Yes, I do. I do. I do. You mentioned the dinner table, and I let that kind of go past, but I want to revisit that dinner table because we've really gotten away in America with the whole family sitting down together to sit and to talk without a television on, without a mobile phone in hand, without other devices, and basically eliminating all distractions but your fellow family members or friends who are at the table. And research has shown that families that sit and eat together receive many benefits. They keep up with each other's lives. It gives them a respite from the electronic devices that consume them. It creates connectedness between family members, and even things such as better digestion and assimilation of nutrition, because we're focused on what we're doing. We're not being distracted. We're talking with our loved ones, and we're being conscious about eating our food. In the United States, you got to admit, Judith, a lot of people eat without, and I'm a guilty person on this. I eat fast, and
Yeah.
all the men in my family ate fast. I still eat fast, but we tend to consume things without even thinking about what we're consuming, not in terms of the quality of it or anything, but actually tasting the food and having the sensory experience.
Exactly. I mean, food is very important here. You often hear the expression farm to table. Um, Italians love getting really fresh food, and that's why they shop every day instead of once a week at Costco or Sam's Club or wherever the heck it is. Filling up your basket for a week or two. No, they shop every day because they want it to be fresh, and you cannot expect to eat fast here. It is simply not possible. If someone invites you to their home for a meal, you're not going to be there for an hour. You're going to be there for hours, especially especially if it's a Sunday. And it's a totally different rhythm of life. My husband and I never had children, unfortunately, of our own, but I remember going to my friend's house who had children, and everybody was eating at a different time, because this child had soccer, this other child had ballet. Everybody was eating something different because this child didn't like this kind of food and this one liked that kind of food. And you just do not see that in Italy. You sit down at the table as a family. In fact, everything shuts down in a lot of these small towns. And I'm in Abruzzo, the region of Abruzzo, which is away from Milan, away from Rome. It's away from the bigger cities, Turin, Bologna. But people still in these small towns, and even to some extent in the bigger towns, shops will close down at 1 o'clock, and then people go home and they eat their lunch at home. And the school children go home and they eat their lunch at home. So, as I said, eating is almost a sacramental act here.
Yes.
And I grew up in the New York area, right outside of New York City in Bayonne, New Jersey, as you mentioned. And we'd eat at hot dog stands. Remember, standing up
Yes.
at a hot dog stand
And
and
hot
eating your
pretzels.
or hot pretzels, or getting a bagel and eating it on the street. Walking to your work. Um, those all the years that I was a journalist, most of my colleagues and myself included, we'd eat lunch at our desks. And
Yeah.
half the time we'd be on the phone eating our lunch. No, that just isn't done here, and I think it's a healthier way to live.
We talked so much today about mindful living, but
what we're talking about right now, Judith, is mindful eating, which is a component of mindful living. You want to consciously be eating. And even my brother's in the restaurant business. And I remember he told me one time he's sitting with his wife and his daughter, and he would give lessons to his daughter. He would say, think about the people who were in the fields, who cultivated these tomatoes and this lettuce and in the factory making this pasta, all the people all over the world, the work that they put into this so that we could enjoy it right now. They did all the work for us, and yet here we are able to enjoy it. So it enlarged the whole vision. That whole vision in the creation of that food is also like a sacrament. You hear people talk about, you know how this works, Judith. If you were to make a wonderful meal and somebody asks you for the recipe and you handed it over to that person, they could make the exact same recipe and it will comes out tasting different because it has so much to do with the love that's put into it or the attitude that's put into it, with the care that's put into it. It sounds kind of magical, but food is indeed magical. In fact, one of the things I complain about with wine, I think wine is magic because you go to a restaurant, you're surrounded with friends and maybe family, you're drinking wine. It's an outstanding bottle of wine. You look at the label, maybe even take a photograph of the label with your mobile phone, thinking, I got to get a bottle of this. I go buy the bottle, I open it up at home on a good occasion, and it doesn't taste the same because I'm not in the same environment. The whole vibratory state around us is different, and I'm not with the same people. So beer is just the opposite. Beer is very stable. Beer tastes the same really everywhere you drink it, but wine is very magic in my estimation. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm sure you're a wine drinker.
Well, when you were talking, Mike, I kept thinking about the brilliance of the genius of Jesus saying to his followers, "Remember me through bread and wine." The most basic components of the dinner table, the most, the things that everyone can identify with. And someone told me a story about a person they knew who every time they picked up bread on the dinner table, they thought about Christ, they thought about Jesus. And I thought that was so beautiful. And every time, every time we sip a wine, it can be a sacramental experience because it relates to uh, the bread and the wine of the communion altar. So it's all kind of interrelated when you think about it.
Yes, it absolutely is. Judith Valente writes, my Italian friends have an attitude that looks out at the world with a sense of openness, attention, and wonder. And, one of the things biblically they talk about being like the child again. Maintaining a sense of wonder is one of the most difficult things you can do because when you've lived, as long as I've lived, as long as you've lived, things can become very routine very easily. Everything we see, everything we do can have that feeling of routineness. It's very difficult to have that sense of wonder, unless I suppose we live that contemplative life that you espouse.
Right. I think you just gave a very good definition of the contemplative life by reading that passage. And I'm so glad you brought it up because a friend of mine, a fellow writer named Kathleen Tarr, Tarr, she's a poet and a writer, talks about taking a vow of wonder. And I'm so drawn to that idea that we can every day wake up renewing our vow of wonder, even if we're seeing even if we're walking the same streets, we're taking the same roads to work. Um, Even if we're sitting at the same kitchen table every day it's going to be a little bit different if you're looking at it with those eyes of wonder. And I just also read an article, an interview rather, with the poet laureate of the U.S., Ada Limon, where she's talking about startlement, um, as regaining a sense of startlement about our world and, just thinking about things in a different way. And one of the examples she gave was the birds see us before we see the birds. Now think about that. That's kind of interesting. And so ever since I read that interview, I've been walking around trying to look at the birds, look at the various birds that are out there and thinking, wow, they're seeing me too. And it's a little bit of a different way of looking at the world.
Yes. Yeah, we tend to always see things outwardly. We're the observer
Yeah.
and they're around. And oftentimes there's this sense that animals are clueless as to our existence. But in reality, animals, because they have predators, they're very aware of everything going on around them. And I think that often gets overlooked is that animals as a sense as a means of survival, they're very aware of the things around them. And not just for survival, but you want to be connected to your environment. You want to know exactly what's surrounding you and so on. We don't have the market on that.
Well,
Um,
we tend to think we're the center of the universe, and
exactly.
all you have to do is really go out and look at the night sky on a nice clear night when there are a lot of stars, and lately the planet there's several planets have been in alignment over the last couple of months. All you have to do is look at the night sky and know, gee, we're not it. There's a lot of other it's out there.
Well, and we're not even central
Yeah.
necessarily. I'm glad you brought this up because, we had Copernicus who was nearly murdered because he said, hey, mathematically, I've just figured out the universe isn't revolving around the Earth. We're actually revolving around the sun, which was, of course, heretical at the time because no, everything's revolving around us. But mathematically, he was able to prove it. And I said, I wonder if ever a Copernicus of cosmology could come along who could show in some way, don't ask me how, it seems impossible, but we are not the center of creation. We are not the crown of creation, as the Hindus call it. We are one expression of the creation of the supreme being, and we make ourselves central because any living being spends time really making itself a central character in the story. And we being, storytellers and all, and I don't mean because a person's a writer. Everybody's got their own story to tell one way or the other. In fact, I was reading the other day one of my favorite quotes. The most important story that you can tell is the story about yourself, because we all believe these things. We all have stories about ourselves. We all have these conceptions of ourselves. But I'm getting off course here. I think that the fact that we see human beings as central to creation is another reason why there's so much atheism, because what does it inevitably lead to? If there's a God, how could he let this happen? If there's a God, how could it let this happen? Meanwhile, we see all kinds of species going into extinction, and ant battles that are epic. I mean, enormous ant battles going on around other parts of the world, and we think nothing of it because they're incidental to our existence. Not to get too much into this whole thing, but you really triggered me on that, and I think it's really important for us to step back and not think in terms of we're it. Well, all you have to do is look to the sky and look at it was a C.S. Lewis who said, when a person looks to the sky, sees the stars, and realizes they're an infinitesimal
Yeah.
component of the universe, he or she has had their first spiritual experience.
Right, right. You mentioned that quote about the most important story we can tell is who am I? I think the most important question we can ask is who are you? Um, Trying to understand the other person, I think is a really important aspect to being human and to being closer to the divine. You mentioned the conflicts going on in the world. Well, God didn't cause these conflicts. Even these conflicts that are based in religion, God didn't cause them. We cause them. Human
Hmm.
beings cause them. And it's because we somehow separate ourselves into tribes from time to time, and that gets us into a lot of trouble. And so I think putting the focus on trying to understand the other person is a really important aspect of the contemplative life. but also living a more peaceful life and living in a more peaceful world, which we certainly are seeing seeing today. The
The
detritus and
scourge of,
yeah,
yeah,
the
the scourge of a
scourge.
lack of connectedness.
Yeah.
And I was, all these shootings, all these alienated youth. I doubt they're sitting at the dinner table with their families and having, connected discussions. They're obviously feeling alienated. They're lonely. They don't
Yes.
feel a part of anything. They don't feel a part of anything larger than themselves. And it's not only I mean, it's catastrophic. It's not only tragic for them personally, but then it's catastrophic for society where we don't even feel safe among ourselves. And this is an American phenomenon. This is not something that's happening everywhere. But it goes to show that, in fact, this plays in, I think, to the next quote I want to read from your book. It says here, Italy is revered for its storied art and architecture, superb food, classic wines, and elevated aesthetic sense, be it in fashion or product design. What I appreciate most is its gentler, more balanced way of life, what might be described in a kind of shorthand as la dolce vita, the sweet life.
Right. Yeah, again, I think that really captures my experience and the experience of so many people in Italy. It doesn't mean that Italians don't work or they don't work hard. It doesn't mean that they don't struggle, but they have I think Italians have a sense of when to work and when to stop work. That sense of balance that I often found when I was working as a journalist was way out of whack. My life was way too much work and too little self-care and time for leisure and to simply do nothing. Um, Italians understand that. I mean, they get 5 weeks of vacation and it doesn't seem to affect their economy. They're the third largest economy in Europe. I mean, who gets 5 weeks of vacation in the US unless maybe you're the CEO and maybe not even the CEO of a corporation, because then you have to be on all the time or your board of directors will boost you out. Um,
Yeah, you
but
have to get senior. You have to be very senior to get up to 6 weeks, or in some companies,
yeah,
8 weeks, but you have to work for decades before you get to that
decades.
point.
Yeah, I know. I know. And then there's the whole thing about universal health care. I know this is a big debate. This is a big bugaboo in the United States to talk about, universal health care, government funded health care. But Italy has a very, people in Italy have a very good longevity record. I think the average age is something like 83 here, if I'm getting my numbers right. Italy has the second highest longevity. The people of Italy have the second highest longevity in all of Europe, second only to Switzerland. Okay, Switzerland. Who argues with Switzerland? And the United States is 48th in longevity. So you tell me, who's
Who's
who's health,
healthier?
healthier? Exactly.
Yeah, and it starts in between the ears. It starts with mentally, emotionally. If that's not there, then everything starts to degrade. Everything below the head begins to degrade if the head's not right. Um, you know, why aren't Italians procreating more? They're I think second behind
Yeah.
Japan as the oldest society in the world, and they're just not having babies like they used to. So, and it's not just Italy; it's happening in lots of places in the world. But Italy is a very old society, and they're not procreating. What's going on?
Yeah, it's a very big irony to me because Italians love children. I mean, children go everywhere. Um, I used to sit on my balcony when I was living in the small town for 3 months, and it was around the corner from a primary school. And the kids would come running out of primary school, and there would be grandparents and parents meeting them, to take them home from school or to take them home for lunch. And they would just be hugging these kids as they ran out of their schoolyard. it's a very ironic thing to me. I think part of it is there's a sense that maybe they can't provide for children as well as they could. Um, it's hard to fire people in a place like Italy. There's a lot of protections, and so it makes it a little more difficult probably a lot more difficult for younger people to get into the workforce. And I think younger people are worried about getting a steady job, getting a good job, just as they are in the United States. I mean, in the United States, people are getting married later and later in life as well because of fear of not being able to provide for their families, fear of not being able to save enough to buy a house, for example. So I don't have the answer to that, Mike. Why I'm not a sociologist, why they're not having children, but I do think it has something to do with this um, concern about being able to provide for children adequately. Yeah.
You also write, destroying historic buildings in Italy is nearly impossible. Italy is one of those societies that honor its past. It's got beautiful buildings, beautiful architecture, and the people of Italy seem to realize that we are standing on the shoulders of the people who built the Colosseum, who built the Forum, who built all kinds of historic structures that are all over our country. And we revere that rather than decide, well, let's tear this thing down and build modern condominiums.
Yeah, I live now 2 hours, 2.5 hours south of Chicago in a college town. And there was this beautiful church on a corner when I first married my husband and moved from Chicago down to Normal, Illinois, in central Illinois. And and one day they just knocked it down to put up a CVS pharmacy. I mean, it was a beautiful Gothic church, and that just kind of thing just wouldn't happen in Italy. And now in my hometown of Normal, Illinois, where I live now, college town, Illinois State is there. They're talking about destroying a building that has a long time mural on it that was very beloved by the community, but for some reason they want to knock that building down and probably put up another, pharmacy or some stupid thing. Um, you know, yeah, I mean, there is this appreciation of the past, and I'm gonna turn it towards something else that is also related. I told you I was here for 3 months right after COVID. The COVID rules sort of opened up and people could travel again. And I noticed in Italy there was no problem with people social distancing, for example. You walked into church and there were these green dots on the pews telling you, how far apart you should sit. And there were signs on the doorways to businesses saying, 6 people at a time inside. And, nobody got offended by this. Nobody showed up in Rome with guns, demanding that businesses reopen and the stores reopen and we not wear masks. People wore masks everywhere. And I think it was because they had experienced plague in their history. They knew what it was like. Or, I mean, they didn't personally know, but they knew in their history there were things like this. There were epidemics like this. And they were more open to solving it all together. And one thing that really struck me when I came here was that at communion time in the Catholic churches, people would pull out these hand sanitizers, these little bottles of hand sanitizers. They would pull them out of their pocket or their purse. They would sanitize their own hands before they went to communion, and then they would offer their bottle to the person next to them if they didn't have a bottle of their own. And I thought this was so telling of the community spirit with which they faced this great epidemic. And Italy was hit even harder than the United States by
Yes,
COVID.
got hit
And,
badly.
And yet, we people were protesting in the streets about the stay-at-home orders and the wearing of the masks and showing up at state capitals with guns. I mean, we didn't know how to face it as a country, as a community, as a whole. And I think what you were saying about the respect for buildings, well, there's also a sense of history here, that history didn't just begin 100, 200, 300 years ago here. You say, began 3,000 years ago.
You know, there's also some countries are me first. The United States is a me first country. My wife and I went to Japan this year and one of the reasons I want to go to Japan, I wanted to go for a long time, but they're the antithesis of Americans. And I love American spirit, but I also love the fact that the Japanese and I think the Italians are very much in this category. It's society first, that it's not just individual rights, society has rights too, and there's cooperation. And I saw things in Japan like trains and such that were immaculate and with seats that would have been torn apart if they were put on a U.S. train. There was just so much more cooperation. And, when you reference COVID, I believe I'm quoting from your book right now, during COVID in Italy, in their narrow houses and cramped apartments, neighbors instead serenaded one another from their balconies, singing and playing musical instruments to shore up everyone's spirits. That was on national news right here in the United States. They were showing that. The Italians singing across alleys and across streets. So there was again that Italian spirit and that the spirit that says reach out and connect with other people and participate with them in the singing and the playing.
Yeah, and it didn't matter, who was the president at the time. This came from the people. This came up from the grassroots up. We could say we had poor leadership in America during the COVID crisis. I won't even go there. But it wasn't the president of Italy or the prime minister telling people to do this. They just did it out of their hearts.
Yes, spontaneous.
Spontaneously.
I don't know.
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead. Finish that thought, please.
No, and it's not to say there aren't good things going on in the United States. I mean, we have a can-do attitude about things. And, for example, I'm the daughter of a truck driver and a woman who went to work at a factory so that I could go to a private Catholic school, high school. And yet I grew up, I got a college education, and I became a national journalist. That might be harder here in Italy. It might be harder to break out of your class here in Italy, your social status here in Italy. So I don't want your listeners, Mike, to feel as though everything is grand in Italy and things are not so great in the US, because there are many, many good things about our country.
Yes. Yeah. But, these discrepancies, the differences are telling, and it gives us an opportunity to integrate more of the good life, la dolce vita, into American society and vice versa. The Italians maybe could stand to work a little bit harder. Who knows? Now, I'm not sure if this was a note that I wrote down for myself or I'm quoting from the book, but I wrote here, conversation is a bonding agent between people. Longevity research shows that one of the constants when it comes to good health and longevity is family and friend relationships. I mean, all these studies that are done about the people who lived 100 and beyond, and they're physically replete and they're mentally still replete, none of them say, I went to the gym every day, or I ate blueberries every morning, or I never drank a drop of alcohol, or I never ordered dessert. They don't say any, or I had a shot glass of apple cider vinegar every day. That's not what happens with people with longevity. But one of the constants, really the only constants, constant within those research efforts has been people who have strong relationships with family or friends, and that they believe in something larger than themselves. And it doesn't have to be God. An atheist can believe that, hey, society is larger than me, civilization is larger than me, and I feel connected to it, and I'm going to help support it. And I've got good relationships with other people. It promotes mental health. Mental health promotes good physical health and longevity.
Right. Yeah. The sense that your life has meaning and that you have a purpose is comes through in all those longevity studies. Mother Teresa, when she, now Saint Teresa of Calcutta, when she first came to the United States, said something very astute. She said, the great American illness is not heart disease or cancer, it's loneliness. And
Yes.
recently, the previous past Surgeon General of the United States said that there is an epidemic of loneliness in our country, and it particularly affects the elderly and the very young. And I think that that is a very sad thing. One of the things I noticed right off the bat when I started spending extended stays here is the amount of conversation, the amount of talking that goes on. They're talking in the piazzas, they're talking on park benches. They're talking with their windows and their doors open so that you get, as you pass houses, you get snippets of conversation that's going on. And we had an interesting experience when my husband got, I think it was bronchitis that he got. And he had to go to the doctor every day for these shots. Instead of giving him antibiotics, he got these shots. And I noticed that the same people were showing up at the doctor's office every day. And then I finally realized that they weren't all there because they were sick. They were there for the conversation. The doctor's office was a place to go and see and be seen and, chat with people and find out what was going on, the doctor's office. And so I think it has to do with people living, as you mentioned, in very cramped quarters, often very narrow buildings. And so they have to get out. They have to get out into the air. And that's why there's these, beautiful big piazzas all over Italian cities. So, and parks, so people can get out, take the air, as they say, cambiare l'aria, to change the air, as they say in Italian. And this lends itself to just people talking with each other. My landlord in Cassino, when I lived in Cassino, which is up by Rome, about an hour and a half from Rome, in the province of Lazio, he was 83 years old. But every morning he would come down 3 flights of stairs from the building we were living in, walk about 50 minutes in his leather jacket and his black fedora to the same cafe and meet with his retired friends. And they would sit and they would read the paper, or they would chit chat about the day's news or sports or their families. And it was a way that he thrived. It was the companionship, it was the physical exercise he got walking to the cafe and back every day, which helped him to live. And now I just was in contact with him. He's now 94 years old and
Wow.
was living on his own pretty much until recently when he did have some health problems. And now he's in an assisted living place.
One of the things that happens that reminds me of Europe here in the United States is I'll go to Starbucks and work on my laptop just to have more people, because I'm normally working from home, and just have people around me and the cacophony of conversation and music playing. And actually, not a lot of conversation takes place, but there, and I've seen it in other places too, not just in Starbucks, but you get this group of maybe 5 or 6 older men in their 80s, and they meet there every day and they sit together and they have their coffee and they just chat about whatever's on their mind, what they read in the paper that morning, the sports contests that happened the night before. And these guys are always smiling. They're happy to see each other. They smile and they have conversation. And that just doesn't happen very, very much in our country. The other thing I want to
No,
point out is, no, go ahead and comment on
no.
that, and then
What I
I
see
have
in
a follow-up.
Starbucks is people in their individual bubbles. They're either
Yes.
looking at their phones or they're or like you said on your computer. And I wish there were more of that little groups meeting on a regular basis or even a daily basis. I wish there was more of that.
Yeah, and I'm in my bubble when I'm in there too. Although if anybody starts up with me, I'm happy to chat. In fact, that leads me to I just returned from a cruise to Alaska. My wife and I were on this cruise, and at the end of the cruise, I was it was a final day, and everybody was going to be getting off the ship, and I was in an elevator, full elevator. Nobody was saying anything, and I just happened to make the comment that, well, we're a lot quieter at the end of the trip than we were at the beginning of the trip. And everybody started breaking out into conversation. And
Mhm.
my point being that so often we're just quiet around one another. We're a little self conscious about just bringing something up, just speaking up. But when you do that, people, you can see that people are hungry to talk. They would like to
Right,
talk, but they're reticent to be the one who ignites the match. And I've never been
right.
that way. I've always been one to speak up, and I ask a lot of being a journalist myself. And my wife says, "Why do you have to ask so many questions?" I said, "Because people are starving to talk about themselves. I ask them questions about themselves, and I don't think very many people get asked about themselves. And once they start asking them about themselves, they are full of chatter, and I learn a lot of things about their lives, and it enriches my life."
Right. Right.
And I think that's
And
very
it
much what
has,
happens in Italy, what you're talking about there.
but it also has to start with us. As you said, you have to be the match. You have to light the match, to be the one that starts the conversation. We can't sit back and say, "Oh, nobody's talking here." No, we have to be the ones to start that conversation, to create that sense of belonging and community.
You know, I tend to think of Italy, and people listening to this might be thinking in terms of, I should make a visit to Italy. I'd love to see this stuff. It would be a great time to make a vacation to Italy. And I will tell you and them, you know this very well. There's a couple of countries out there in the world, Italy and France, I think, chief among them. The United States as well, of course, because we're a very large country. But if you go to Italy, unless you're going to spend 6 months there at a time, maybe more, you're going to need to make repeated trips. There is so much to see in Italy. Even though it's not a massive country, it's a country that is so rich in architecture, in history, in its cities, in its countryside, its food, its beverage, and so on. I've been to Italy, to Rome and Venice. Venice, I think, is the most romantic city in the world that I've been to anyway. I'm going back next year to Italy to see other parts of Italy. But wouldn't you agree that Italy requires a tremendous amount of time to not only to see the sights, but also really insinuate yourself into the people that we're talking about who are so friendly and living that sweet life, as you say.
Since I wrote the book, people ask me, well, where should I go? And I say, well, try to pick a place that you don't know anything about. There's all these other regions. People, as you said, people know Florence, they know Rome, they know Venice, maybe they know Bologna, maybe. Uh,
Maybe
pick a
Pisa.
yeah, Cinque Terre and the Amalfi Coast. Pick a place that you really don't know that much about. There's all these other regions like Abruzzo, like Basilicata, like Sicily. Sicily is a great place to go. There's so much history there, and the people are so nice in Sicily. They really are. That somehow it got associated with the mafia somewhere along the line, but that's not the everyday person that you meet. Um, so, pick a place and maybe stay there for 2 weeks. Take day trips out to different places. Sicily is a great place to do that, by the way, where you could take lots of day trips and still have a home base. And Basilicata, there's Molise, there's all these places up north, in the north of the country that I haven't even explored yet. In the many regions near France, for example, in Switzerland, that I'd like to go to. That each have its own character. It's like saying, you know, it's like saying, I know the United States because I've been to New Jersey. You know, or I know what the United States is like because I've been to California. Well, no, California is so varied. Not even Californians know all about California. So Italy is like that. It's a very, very varied place, and you can make repeated trips here and never see it all or know it all.
Well, you make reference to quote unquote slow tourism.
Mm.
Explain that.
That's exactly what I mean. Staying in one place for an extended period of time. So you experience the rhythm of life in that place. You get to experience the customs of that place, the culinary arts of that place, and begin to form relationships. Slow tourism is not about seeing as many sights as you can see. It's about forming relationships with people. And I think that's the gift of travel. The gift of travel is it lets us know about other people. And in doing so, often reveals something about ourselves.
Yes, yes. Um, you know the author Elena Ferrante, is that right?
Yes. Well, I don't know her personally. I know her books, of course. The
Yeah,
Neapolitan, the
the
Neapolitan
Neapolitan
portrait.
novels. I forget how many there are, but my wife and
Four,
I have
four.
read. There's four of them, and
Yeah.
they just were hugely popular. I mean, she sold tons and tons of books. Tried to keep her identity secret, but it did end up breaking out that who she was, which is kind of sad. She should that anonymity should have been preserved, but it wasn't. But interesting life in Italy, and it's not all pretty. There's the
No.
there is like anywhere else that there are people who take advantage of each other. There's people who live life in poor lives, and but Elena Ferrante, really a landmark novelist, say in the last 20 years or so, not even maybe more like
Yeah.
15. But
Mm.
life in Italy, if you're not going to make the trip there, or prior to making the trip there, you might want to read some of those Neapolitan novels. They read very easily and they're very rich in characters and content. And while you're at it, drink an Aperol Spritz, perhaps. Aperol Spritz is still practically the national drink of Italy, Judith. Is that true, or has
Yeah.
that?
Outside of wine. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and yeah, you can find Aperol Spritz all over America now. I mean, it definitely has spread over here. Now, you mentioned there are more churches in Italy than grocery stores. What is
Yes.
that? What does that say? I mean, you're talking about a country that is um, home to the Vatican, very
Right.
Catholic, but at the same time, the food center of the world. I suppose France and Italy. There's really very few countries that can talk about their food the way the French and the Italians can. Not to exclude countries like Thailand or what have you, but Italy is very much known for its food and its fresh food, its daily trips to the grocery stores. Why so many churches relative to grocery stores? I mean, there's a lot of both, no doubt, but what does it say to you that there's more churches than grocery stores?
There's a real sense, as I said, of the sacred and the ordinary and the divine. And when I talked about those processions where they carry the statues of the Madonna or the statues of a particular saint through the street, which, by the way, they have a big festival every September called the Saint Gennaro Festival in New York City, which in which they carry the statue of Saint Gennaro, so carried over into the Italian American community in the U.S. as well. But not everybody who lines the streets to watch those processions are going to church every Sunday, not by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a sense of this is our this is our heritage. Catholicism is part of our heritage. And it was kind of what we started out talking about, Mike, you and I. Why do I stay Catholic? Well, it's it's the faith of my ancestors, and I would be denying something in my genes if I somehow turned my back on all of that. And even though I know for a fact a lot of the people who are making the sign of the cross as the statue passes are not seen in the church at Sunday Mass or weekday Mass. It's a part of them. It's a part of their personal heritage that they take very seriously. And the presence of the churches, I can only assume is related to the strength and the power that the Catholic Church, the Vatican, once had in this part of the world. I mean, I think it's only been since 1978 that we've had a non-Italian pope. So
Yes.
so that says something about how deep deep the roots of Catholicism are in Italy.
So what is next for Judith Valente? What are you working on now, Judith?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm working on a biography of the great American peace activist Eileen Egan, who was Mother Teresa's traveling companion and also Dorothy Day's traveling companion. And it was Eileen Egan working behind the scenes to get, for example, the Second Vatican Council to recognize or to write about um, to reject war in the nuclear age, to reject all war in the nuclear age. It was Eileen and Dorothy Day working for this, but Eileen was the one working behind the scenes, going to the individual bishops, giving them documentation about nuclear weaponry and things like that, that worked its way into these encyclicals that eventually came out of the Second Vatican Council. And Eileen was also instrumental in getting the UN. She was, I guess you would call her a lay observer of some sort at the UN. Um, she was a founder of Pax Christi USA, and she got the UN. She got the UN to recognize the right of people to conscientious objection to
Hmm.
serving in war. And I mean, this was huge. I mean, because for centuries, uh, you know, people just thought, well, your government went to war, you fought for your government. But people like Eileen saw this in a different light. People like Eileen and Dorothy Day saw this in a different light. So Eileen's never gotten the credit that she really deserved. And she brought Mother Teresa to the United States for the first time. She was working with Catholic Relief Services, which is the international aid arm of the Catholic bishops. And Eileen was, I think she was the first I know she was the first lay woman that they hired, not the first lay person. And so she was instrumental in bringing aid, for example, to refugees after World War II and then refugees after the Vietnam War. And she's not that well known. She's one of these women, like the mathematicians who worked on the space program in the 60s who never got their due until
Yes.
recently.
Hidden
She
Figures, great movie.
she's another hidden figure of history who happens to be a woman. And so I'm trying to write the first ever biography of Eileen Egan. And then I'm the past president of the International Thomas Merton Society. Merton, of course, was a Trappist monk who wrote a great deal about the contemplative life and introduced a lot of lay people to what it means to be a contemplative in the world. And I'd like to do a book of reflections on Merton's writings. So those are two projects in the offing.
Wow. Big projects.
Big
Congratulations
projects.
on those. Well, congratulations on your new book. Again, for our listeners, the book is called The Italian Soul, subtitled How to Savor the Full Joys of Life. The author is Judith Valente, my guest from Abruzzo, Italy, as of now, heading back to the United States soon. Judith, thanks a million for coming on the program and discussing all things Italy and La Dolce Vita.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's just been a delight to talk with you.